The government's admittedly formidable PR machinery, exploiting a public that is desperate for relief, has successfully planted the idea that only a state of emergency will save them. People now believe that if you want the heavy presence of the security forces, particularly soldiers, in your community, then you need a state of emergency. They now believe that if you want to sleep with your windows and your doors open and wake up alive, then you need a state of emergency. This is not true. The Governor General and Parliament, respectively, must be satisfied that action has been taken or is immediately threatened by any person or body of persons of such a nature and on so extensive a scale as to be likely to endanger the public safety. Mr. Speaker, what this describes is an armed rebellion, a state under siege, or at least a defined group taking or planning some serious concerted action. For example, the circumstances orchestrated by Christopher Coke and his cronies in 2010 clearly met that standard. A state of emergency is not a crime-fighting tool. The government cannot impose one to maintain the peace or to avoid the recurrence of an emergency. It is a temporary measure to address an existing emergency. The government has to show at the time of each extension that the circumstances justify such a drastic step. It is the most drastic impairment of personal rights allowed by the Constitution. And he concludes, it is my view that a court would hold that its continuation is unconstitutional and the Parliament has a duty to terminate it. Jamaica Constabulary Forces year-to-date statistics published, I think up to April 27th, the weekend before the declaration, revealed that year-to-date, January to April 27th, I think it was, in Hanover, murder is down 35% and shooting is down 24%. In Westmoreland, murder down 16% and shooting down 38%. In St. James, even though murders and shootings are up between January and April this year relative to the same period last year, the figures are actually the second lowest for both murder and shooting in the last 5 years. And I'm not disputing that this is certainly still way too high, but it is not, by Jamaica's recent standards anyway, an emergency level. But if we use an international benchmark, then essentially we'll say that Jamaica should have had a state of emergency for the last quarter century, and that it will be there for the foreseeable future. So again, you know, the international benchmark for murders is 6 per 100,000. We're way far from that. But Prime Minister, if you are making this argument for some objective benchmark, because I can't accept that it can be something as subjective as whenever the heads of the security forces feel it is justified. What I think you need to do, Prime Minister, is give us what is this objective standard. What the Prime Minister has offered today is that the heads of the security forces have deemed it necessary. So what you're saying is that the 63 elected members of Parliament are being asked to delegate our constitutionally allocated responsibility to decide whether the suspension of citizens' rights is demonstrably justified or not, to two unelected, one military and one paramilitary official. The Prime Minister can characterize it any way he wishes. I never said that the heads are taking away the responsibility from us. I am saying he is asking us, since we have not heard what they're presenting as evidence or information to make this determination, all we are being told is that they have asked for it. We have been presented with no cogent and persuasive evidence from the security forces to suggest that action has been taken or is immediately threatened by any person or body of persons on such a nature and on so extensive a scale as to be likely to endanger the public safety. We have not been presented with that evidence. Nothing has come to us from the heads of the security forces. All we are told by the Prime Minister is that they have recommended it. Therefore, we are not being given a chance to weigh the evidence ourselves and determine whether it meets this constitutionally required test, that the infringements of our rights are demonstrably justified. We do not have the ability to weigh the evidence and come to that decision ourselves. And my point is that that is not consistent with the proper functioning of a parliamentary democracy. Right? In fact, the reason why we're here for the fourth time in just 18 months dealing with another state of emergency is precisely because of the failure of leadership in security policy and security operations to successfully develop and implement violence reduction strategies and plans. That is what has forced us to be here for the fourth time in 18 months. The irony is that never before has there been so much resources available to the Ministry of National Security. Never before. It's a good thing. I'm not criticizing it. But the fact that the capital budget has moved from 2 billion in 2015-2016 to 20 billion in the current year. Simultaneously, the recurrent budget from 54 billion to 72 billion shows that it is not a lack of resources why we're not getting results. What we do know, as was exposed by the DNA consultant who has cut his contract short in frustration, is that the implementation of a critical investigative tool has languished over the last 3 years. This was someone who worked with us at Legislative Committee very hard to develop the DNA legislation, and I can understand why he became so frustrated that 3 years later, there's still no database. There is no sign of law enforcement using these vastly increased financial resources to develop their investigative capabilities so that proper cases can be put together and convictions achieved. In fact, if the government wants to bury a corruption issue, it seems they just have to send it to the GSAF or MOCA or some law enforcement agency where it will likely languish and die. Think of the investigations that have flowed from the Petrojam Auditor General's report, from NESAL, or even the recent Ministry of Education situation where we had a horrid departure of the former minister, although we still have not been given an explanation why. States of emergency, or martial law as it was then called, was used extensively by British colonial authorities. Governor Eyre declaring martial law to suppress the so-called Morant Bay Rebellion was one such example, which involved two of our national heroes. What we are debating today is our duty to uphold not just any law, but our Constitution, the highest law. And if the duty of the citizen, is to uphold the law, then how much greater a duty should we have as lawmakers to uphold that same law? If the majority of this parliament, if the two-thirds majority of this parliament or the vast majority of the people of Jamaica agree that they want the powers of a state of emergency available as a routine tool of policing, then let us amend the Constitution. Let us amend the Constitution. It wouldn't be my personal choice, but if we're going to use it this way, then let's do it properly. Let us amend the Constitution. At least then it would be lawful. However, I cannot support the unconstitutional use of the state of emergency as a routine tool of policing as is being proposed by the government here today.